Welcome to another journey through the tedious yet fascinating details of our ancestors' daily struggles. Tonight, we explore the seemingly simple act of lighting a medieval home, a task so fraught with expense, danger, and inconvenience that even the wealthiest nobles would find themselves cursing the very candles they could barely afford to burn. Through 4 interconnected stories, we'll discover how something as basic as illumination became one of medieval life's most persistent challenges, shaping everything from sleep patterns to social hierarchies to the very architecture of domestic spaces. You wake before dawn in 13th century London, not to the gentle glow of electric streetlights filtering through modern curtains, but to complete and utter darkness. The kind of darkness that presses against your eyelids like a physical weight, broken only by the faintest suggestion of starlight seeping through the gaps in your wooden shutters. Your first task of the day before breaking your fast, before checking on your livestock, before attending to any of the 100 other demands of medieval life is to coax fire from the dying embers of yesterday's hearth. This single act, so automatic and effortless in our modern world, could determine whether your family would have light for the coming day, or spend another evening huddled in shadow. But you are not just any medieval householder. You are Thomas, the candlemaker, one of London's newest members of the Chandlers Guild. And your life revolves entirely around the production of those small, smoking cylinders that your neighbors simultaneously depend upon and despise. Your guild, formally established just decades ago as candlemaking evolved from a household chore into a specialized craft, represents both opportunity and burden in equal measure. The guild system that governs your trade emerged in England and France during this very century, transforming what had once been a simple domestic task into a regulated profession with its own complex hierarchy of masters, journeymen, and apprentices. The workshop attached to your modest dwelling reeks perpetually of rendered scrooge animal fata smell, so pervasive that it clings to your clothes, your hair, your very skin, until you can no longer distinguish where the stench of your trade ends and your own natural odor begins. The scent follows you through the narrow streets, announcing your profession to every passerby long before they see the rows of yellowing tallow candles hanging from the wooden beams of your storefront. This is the smell of medieval illumination, not the clean, pleasant fragrance we might associate with modern candles, but the thick, cloying odor of sheep fat and beef suet slowly oxidizing in the London air. Your apprentice, young William, arrived before dawn, as he does every day, his thin frame silhouetted against the dim glow of the workshop's single oil lamp, a luxury you can barely afford but necessity demands for the precise work of candle making. Together, you begin the day's labor with the methodical process of preparing the tallow that arrived yesterday from the local butchers. The fat, delivered in great greasy chunks that still bear traces of blood and gristle, must be carefully rendered over a low fire. The liquid fat slowly separated from the crispy residue that will be sold off as animal feed or soap-making material. The rendering process alone consumes hours of constant attention. Too hot and the tallow scorches, producing candles that burn with black, sooty flames and fill rooms with acrid smoke. Too cool and the fat never fully liquefies, leaving impurities that will cause your finished products to sputter and drip excessively. William tends the fire with the practiced care of someone who has learned through expensive mistakes that consistency of temperature matters more than speed of production. The workshop fills with the sound of gently bubbling fat and the occasional hiss when drops of moisture still clinging to the raw materials meet the hot liquid as the tallow renders. You prepare the wicks that will determine the quality of your finished candles. Cotton string, when you can afford it, twisted loose enough to allow air to flow through the fibers, but tight enough to maintain structural integrity throughout the burning process. More often, you rely on the dried stalks of rushes gathered From the marshy ground outside London's walls, stripped of their outer skin and dried until they become fibrous wicks that burn steadily, but produce an even smokier flame than cotton. Each wick must be cut to precise lengths, tested for proper thickness, and prepared for the repetitive dipping process that will transform simple plant matter into the core of a medieval household. Lighting system dot the economics of your trade weigh heavily on every decision. A pound of your finished tallow candles sells for 1.5 pence in the London market, representing half a day's wages for a common laborer. Yet your costs are substantial. The raw tallow, the fuel to render it, the time spent in production, the guild fees that ensure your right to practice your trade, and the various taxes levied by both church and crown on artisans like yourself. Your profit margin is so narrow that a single batch of ruined candle-scorched tallow, improperly sized wicks, or any of a dozen other potential disasters can wipe out weeks of earnings. The social position of your profession occupies an uncomfortable middle ground in medieval society. You are neither peasant nor noble, neither completely dependent on a lord's largesse nor truly independent of the complex web of obligations that bind medieval communities together. Your guild membership grants you certain privileges: the right to practice your trade within the city walls, protection from competition by unlicensed chandlers, and access to the collective bargaining power when negotiating with suppliers of raw materials. Yet you remain subject to guild regulations that control everything from the quality standards of your products to the hours during which you may conduct business. The morning's work progresses with the familiar rhythm of repeated dipping. Multiple wicks, suspended from wooden rods, are lowered into the vat of molten tallow, withdrawn to cool, then dipped again. Each cycle adds a thin layer of fat to the growing candles, slowly building up the bulk necessary for hours of burning time. Your hands, stained permanently yellow-brown from years of handling tallow, move with automatic precision, gauging the temperature of the fat by the way it clings to the wicks, judging the proper cooling time by the slight hardening visible at the candle tips. Between dips, you discuss with William the orders that have accumulated over the past week. Lady Margaret requires 12 candles for her household's evening meals. Lord Henry needs 2 pounds of your best work for his manor's winter feast. And the local parish has commissioned 4 pounds for the upcoming religious festival. Each order represents not just income, but reputation: a poorly made candle that gutters out during an important dinner or religious service could damage your standing within the community and cost you future business. Yet even as you work to fulfill these orders, you cannot escape the fundamental irony of your profession. The very products you create, upon which your livelihood depends, represent a luxury that you yourself can barely afford to use. Your own home, like those of most working artisans, remains largely dark after sunset, except for the minimal illumination provided by the hearth fire and the occasional rushlight or damaged candle that cannot be sold. The bulk of your production goes to customers wealthy enough to burn tallow for convenience rather than necessity, while you and your family make do with the dim, flickering light that has served humanity for millennia. As the morning progresses and the first batch of candles begins to take shape, you find yourself contemplating the strange economic position of your trade. You produce light for others while living primarily in darkness yourself, creating luxury items while struggling to maintain even basic comfort in your own household. The candles hanging in neat rows throughout your workshop represent hours of labor, days of income, and months of potential illumination. Yet most will be sold long before you could justify burning them in your own home. This contradiction extends beyond your personal situation to the broader medieval economy. Light itself has become a commodity, measured and sold by the pound, regulated by guilds, and taxed by authorities who recognize its value in the daily life of urban communities. The ability to extend productive hours beyond sunset, to read or conduct business after darkness falls, to provide a sense of security and warmth during the long winter night, all of these benefits come at a cost. that places them beyond the reach of the very people who produce them. But what forces drove this transformation of lighting from a basic household skill to a specialized guild profession? How did something so fundamental as illumination become subject to the same economic pressures that governed the trade in luxury goods? The answers lie in the complex intersection of technological limitations, social hierarchies, and economic realities that defined urban life in 13th century Europe. The transformation of candlemaking from household necessity to guild-regulated profession did not occur in isolation, but rather emerged from the growing complexity of medieval urban life and the increasing stratification of society that characterized the 13th century. As cities expanded and populations concentrated within defensive walls, the simple domestic arrangements that had served rural communities for centuries proved inadequate to meet the needs of merchants, craftsmen, and nobles who required reliable lighting for activities that extended well beyond the natural rhythm of sunrise and sunset. Your guild's formation represented a response to this urban demand, but it also reflected the broader economic forces that were reshaping medieval society. The rise of a money economy, the expansion of trade networks, and the growing sophistication of manufacturing processes all contributed to the specialization that made professional chandlers both possible and necessary. Where once every household had rendered its own cooking fats into crude illumination, the demands of urban life required more consistent quality, larger quantities, and more predictable availability than individual households could provide. The raw materials that form the foundation of your trade arrive through supply chains that stretch across England and beyond. The tallow that fills your rendering vats comes primarily from cattle and sheep butchered in London's markets. But during times of scarcity, you must supplement local supplies with imported animal fats that arrive via merchant networks extending as far as Scotland and Ireland. The quality of these materials varies dramatically depending on their source, the time of year they were produced, and the conditions under which they were transported to your workshop. Winter tallow, rendered from animals that have been well fed throughout the autumn months, produces harder, longer-burning candles with less tendency to drip and sputter. Summer fat, particularly from animals that have been grazing on lean pasture, yields softer candles that must be carefully managed to prevent excessive melting in warm conditions. These seasonal variations force you to maintain different production techniques throughout the year, adjusting temperatures, cooling times, and wick preparations to compensate for the changing characteristics of your raw materials. The economics of tallow acquisition require careful planning and significant capital investment. Butchers prefer to sell their rendered fats in bulk lots, often requiring payment in advance for materials that will not be delivered for weeks or months. This arrangement ties up substantial portions of your working capital while exposing you to the risk that the delivered materials will not meet the quality standards necessary for professional candle production. A single batch of rancid or contaminated tallow can ruin weeks of work and force you to default on orders that prevent months of income. Your relationship with these suppliers involves more than simple commercial transactions. The butchers who provide your raw materials are themselves members of their own guild, with regulations and obligations that sometimes conflict with your needs as a purchaser. During periods when fresh meat is in high demand, religious festivals, noble feasts, or times of plenty when urban populations can afford better food, the guild may restrict the sale of byproducts, like tallow, in order to ensure adequate supplies for their primary customers. These restrictions can leave you scrambling to find alternative sources or force you to pay premium prices for materials that might normally be considered waste products. The Guild of Chandlers' response to these supply challenges involved the establishment of its own network of preferred suppliers, artisans whose reliability and quality had been tested through years of transactions. Guild membership brought access to these networks, but it also imposed obligations that could be burdensome for individual chandlers. When one member defaulted on payment to a supplier, the entire guild might find its access to materials threatened. When quality disputes arose, the guild's reputation could suffer in ways that affected every member's business prospects. The technical aspects of candle production evolved considerably during your generation, driven by competition between guild members and pressure from customers who demanded longer burning, cleaner candles. The traditional dipping process, while reliable, produced candles with irregular shapes and inconsistent burn characteristics. Some of your more innovative colleagues experimented with molded candles, using pewter forms to create perfectly cylindrical products with uniform dimensions. These molded candles commanded higher prices due to their superior appearance and more predictable burning times. But the initial investment in molds and the additional labor required for the molding process made them economically viable only. For high-end customers, the introduction of bleaching techniques represented another significant advancement in your trade. Newly made tallow candles displayed an unappetizing yellow-brown color that reminded users of their animal fat origins. Guild members discovered that exposing finished candles to outdoor air and morning dew for several weeks could produce a more attractive white or cream color that appeared more refined and commanded better prices. However, this bleaching process required additional storage space, extended the time between production and sale, and exposed valuable inventory to weather damage and theft. The competitive landscape within your guild created constant pressure to improve efficiency while maintaining quality standards. Fellow chandlers guarded their technical innovations jealously, viewing improvements in wick preparation, tallow rendering, or finishing techniques as trade secrets that provided competitive advantages. This secrecy slowed the overall advancement of the profession while creating opportunities for individual channelers to establish premium positions within the market. Guild regulations attempted to balance competition with cooperation, establishing minimum quality standards that protected customers while preventing a race to the bottom that might damage the reputation of all guild members. These standards covered everything from the purity of tallow used in production to the proper sizing of wicks, from acceptable levels of smoke production to minimum burning times. Enforcement of these standards required regular inspections of member workshops and finished products, creating an additional layer of bureaucracy that increased costs while providing quality assurance. The pricing structure for your products reflected not only the costs of materials and production, but also the complex social hierarchies that characterized medieval urban life. Wealthy customers expected to pay premium prices for superior products, viewing expensive candles as symbols of their social status rather than mere functional items. Middle-class merchants and successful artisans sought reliable, reasonably priced illumination that would serve their practical needs without excessive cost. Lower-income urban residents, when they purchased candles at all, demanded the cheapest possible products regardless of quality compromises. This market segmentation drove the development of different product lines within your workshop. The finest candles, made from carefully selected tallow and fitted with cotton wicks, were intended for wealthy households and important religious ceremonies. Standard production used mixed tallow grades and rush wicks to create serviceable candles at moderate prices. The lowest grade products, sometimes incorporating recycled tallow from previously burned candles or salvaged from damaged inventory, provided basic illumination for customers who could not afford better alternatives. The seasonal nature of demand created additional economic challenges that required careful planning and cash flow management. Winter months brought peak demand as shortened daylight hours increased the need for artificial illumination. But this high demand period also coincided with increased heating costs, reduced availability of raw materials, and higher transportation expenses that elevated production costs. Summer sales declined substantially as customers relied more heavily on natural light. Yet this slower period provided opportunities to build inventory, conduct maintenance on equipment, and experiment with new techniques. religious calendar events created predictable spikes in demand that allowed guild members to plan production schedules and pricing strategies well in advance. The approach of major festivals like Christmas, Easter, and local saint days generated orders for thousands of pounds of candles from churches. Noble households and merchant families who viewed elaborate illumination as essential to proper celebration. However, these peak demand periods also attracted competition from non-guild producers who ignored quality standards and undercut established prices, forcing legitimate chandlers to balance volume production with profit margins. But the economic pressures facing your guild extended far beyond the simple dynamics of supply and demand, touching on fundamental questions about the role of artificial light in medieval society and the growing tensions between tradition and innovation that would ultimately reshape the entire profession. The true cost of medieval illumination extended far beyond the simple transaction of coins for candles, encompassing a complex web of social obligations, economic dependencies, and cultural assumptions that shaped every aspect of daily life in 13th century England. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, the harsh realities of your profession became increasingly apparent not only in your workshop's financial ledgers, but in the fundamental choices that every household from the wealthiest noble manor to the humblest artisan's cottage faced when darkness fell. The Guild of Chandlers existed within a broader economy where light itself had become a rationed commodity, distributed according to social hierarchies that reflected medieval society's rigid class structure. The stark divide between those who could afford to extend their productive hours through artificial illumination and those who were forced to surrender to darkness after sunset created parallel worlds within the same urban community. Your position as a chandler placed you uncomfortably between these worlds, producing luxury for others while experiencing scarcity yourself. The technical limitations of tallow candles imposed constraints that affected every user regardless of their economic status. Even the finest candles produced in your workshop burned for no more than 8 to 10 hours, requiring constant replacement. Throughout the long winter nights, the flames themselves provided relatively little light, roughly equivalent to a modern 25-watt incandescent bulb band. This dim illumination came at the cost of constant smoke, unpleasant odors, and the ever-present danger of fire. Wealthy households might burn multiple candles simultaneously to achieve adequate lighting for reading or detailed work. But this multiplication of flames also multiplied the associated problems of smoke inhalation, wax dripping, and fire risk. The alternative to tallow candles, beeswax candles, remained largely theoretical for most of your customers due to their extraordinary cost. At 6.5 pence per pound, compared to tallow's 1.5 pence. Beeswax represented more than 2 days' wages for a common laborer and remained accessible only to the wealthiest merchants and highest-ranking nobles. The few beeswax candles that passed through your workshop were typically destined for religious ceremonies or the most important social occasions, where their clean-burning flames and pleasant honey scent justified their premium price. This economic reality created a paradoxical situation where the very people most in need of extended working hours are us artisans, small merchants, and skilled laborers who might increase their earnings through evening work were least able to afford the illumination that would make such work possible. Tailors, scribes, metalworkers, and other craftsmen whose trades required good light found themselves limited to the hours between sunrise and sunset, constraining their productivity and income potential. The economic benefits of artificial lighting remained concentrated among those who could afford it, reinforcing existing social hierarchies rather than providing opportunities for advancement. Your guild's relationship with the church added another layer of complexity to the economics of illumination. Religious institutions represented some of your largest and most reliable customers, requiring hundreds of pounds of candles annually for masses, vigils, and ceremonial occasions. The Church's demand for high-quality candles created a steady market that helped sustain professional chandlers. But religious authorities also imposed moral and theological interpretations on the use of artificial light that complicated your business relationships. Church doctrine emphasized the spiritual symbolism of light as divine illumination, positioning candles as sacred objects rather than mere commodities. This theological framework justified the Church's preference for expensive beeswax candles in liturgical settings, while simultaneously creating moral questions about the use of animal fat candles in religious contexts. Some religious authorities questioned whether tallow candles, derived from creatures that had been slaughtered for food, were appropriate for sacred purposes, leading to complex negotiations about acceptable products for different types of religious services. The guild system itself imposed significant costs that affected the final price of your products and your own economic stability. Guild membership fees, payable annually, represented substantial portions of a chandler's income, particularly for newer members who had not yet established steady customer bases. Additional assessments for guild hall maintenance, ceremonial expenses, and charitable obligations further reduced individual members' take-home earnings. The guild's collective bargaining power with suppliers provided some economic benefits, but these advantages came at the cost of reduced individual autonomy and mandatory participation in guild activities that consumed time and resources. Quality control measures mandated by the guild required investments in equipment, materials, and testing procedures that increased production costs while providing benefits that were difficult to quantify. The guild's reputation for producing reliable candles generated customer confidence that translated into steady demand. But individual chandlers bore the costs of maintaining these standards whether or not they directly benefited from improved sales. Non-compliance with guild standards could result in fines, suspension of trading privileges, or expulsion from the organization, creating economic pressures that forced members to prioritize regulatory compliance over profit maximization. The seasonal economics of your trade created feast or famine cycles that required careful financial planning and often forced guild members into debt relationships with suppliers, customers, or money lenders. Winter months brought peak demand, but also peak costs for raw materials, fuel, and transportation. Summer months offered opportunities to build inventory and conduct maintenance, but reduced sales often meant months of minimal income. These cycles were predictable, but their magnitude varied from year to year depending on weather conditions, agricultural harvests, political stability, and other factors beyond individual chandlers' control. The emergence of competition from non-guild producers represented a growing threat to the economic stability of professional chandlers. Households that had traditionally purchased candles began returning to home production as urban populations became more familiar with rendering and wick preparation techniques. Unlicensed producers operated without guild oversight, offering inferior products at reduced prices that appealed to cost-conscious customers. Rural chandlers operating outside guild jurisdiction could undercut urban prices by avoiding guild fees and quality standards, creating competitive pressure that eroded profit margins for legitimate guild members. The broader economic transformation of 13th century England affected your trade through inflation, currency debasement, and shifts in purchasing power that altered the relationship between candle prices and other commodities. Agricultural productivity improvements increased the urban food supply while reducing rural demand for manufactured goods like candles. Population growth in cities created larger potential markets, but also increased competition for raw materials and drove up costs for workshop space, apprentice wages, and other business expenses. International trade connections began to influence your local market as imported candles, exotic waxes, and alternative lighting technologies reached English ports. Venetian merchants introduced superior wick designs. Flemish producers developed improved rendering techniques, and Islamic technologies offered insights into more efficient lamp designs that competed with traditional candle-based illumination. These foreign influences created opportunities for innovation, but also threatened established business models that had served English channelers for generations. The long-term implications of these economic pressures extended far beyond individual channelers to encompass fundamental questions about the role of technology, social organization, and resource allocation in medieval society. The high cost of artificial lighting reinforced social hierarchies while constraining economic development in ways that would influence European civilization for centuries. Yet, within these constraints, the daily struggles of chandlers like yourself represented humanity's persistent effort to push back against the darkness, to extend the productive day, and to create the small pools of light within which civilization could flourish despite the enormous costs and constant dangers that such illumination entailed. The question that haunted your profession was whether the economic model that had emerged around artificial lighting could sustain itself as social and technological conditions continued to evolve. The tensions between quality and affordability, between guild regulation and individual innovation, between traditional methods and foreign alternatives, all pointed toward fundamental changes that would reshape not only the chandler's trade, but the entire relationship between light, darkness, and daily life in medieval England. You are Margot de Ashby, wife of a middling wool merchant in the bustling city of York, and as October's early darkness creeps through the gaps in your wooden shutters, you face the same daily calculation that confronts every medieval household. How much light can you afford tonight? Your husband, Edmund, sits hunched over his ledger books at the heavy oak table that serves as both workspace and dining surface, squinting in the dim glow of a single tallow candle that represents nearly 3 pence of your household's weekly budget money that could otherwise purchase 2 loaves of bread, a measure of ale, or a pound of salt pork to sustain your family through the coming winter months. The candle's flame dances uncertainly in the draught that perpetually your stone house, casting wavering shadows across Edmund's carefully maintained accounts. Each flicker reminds you of the precious time and money literally burning away in the form of rendered sheep fat and twisted cotton wick. The acrid smoke from the tallow irritates your eyes and throat, while the unpleasant smell of burned animal fat mingles with the household odors of cooking, bodies, and the ever-present dampness that characterizes all medieval dwellings. Yet without this expensive, smoky, malodorous necessity, your family's productive day would end with sunset, shortening the hours available for the detailed bookkeeping that keeps Edmund's business profitable. Your household occupies a precarious position within York's social hierarchy, wealthy enough to afford occasional luxuries like purchased candles, yet not so prosperous that you can burn them without careful consideration of their cost. Edmund's wool trade provides a comfortable living by medieval standards, generating annual income that places your family among the urban middle class. But this prosperity comes with obligations and expectations that strain your resources in ways that pure subsistence farmers never experience. You must maintain appearances appropriate to your station, provide hospitality to Edmund's business associates, and support the various charitable and civic obligations that accompany merchant class status. The mathematics of medieval illumination impose harsh constraints on every aspect of your daily routine. A pound of tallow candles costs 1.5 pence, representing half a day's wages for a common laborer, and typically provides no more than 10 to 12 hours of flickering light. For a household that requires artificial lighting from sunset to bedtime throughout the winter months, this translates to expenses that rival your monthly expenditures on food, fuel, and other basic necessities. The financial pressure becomes even more acute when you consider that poor quality candles burn faster, drip excessively, and produce inferior light, forcing careful evaluation of every purchase to balance cost against performance. Your daily routine revolves around maximizing the utility of each precious flame. Morning tasks that require detailed work mending clothes, preparing food, reviewing household accounts must be completed while natural light streams through your few small windows. Afternoon brings the preparation of dinner and evening activities, all carefully timed to make efficient use of the daylight hours. As darkness approaches, you face the nightly decision of whether current activities justify the expense of lighting a candle or whether your family should simply accept the limitations imposed by natural darkness. The social implications of these lighting decisions extend far beyond simple economics. When Edmund's business associates visit your home for evening meetings, proper hospitality demands adequate illumination regardless of cost. Multiple candles might be burned simultaneously to create an atmosphere of prosperity and comfort, demonstrating your family's social status and commitment to conducting business in appropriate style. These occasions can consume a week's worth of lighting budget in a single evening, but the alternative receiving guests in dimly lit rooms could damage Edmund's reputation and harm his business relationships. Your children, Thomas, aged 12, and Alice, aged 9, have adapted their routines to accommodate the household's lighting limitations. Their formal education takes place during daylight hours at the cathedral school, while evening instruction at home focuses on activities that require minimal illumination, memorizing prayers, practicing songs, or listening to stories that reinforce moral and social lessons, reading and writing practice, which demand good light and careful attention to detail, must compete with other daylight activities for priority in their daily schedules. The seasonal variation in daylight hours creates predictable cycles of feast and famine in your family's lighting needs. Summer evenings allow for extended outdoor activities and delay the need for artificial illumination until well past the children's bedtime. Winter nights stretch endlessly, requiring hours of expensive candlelight for even basic household functions. The transition periods of autumn and spring bring their own challenges as rapidly changing sunrise and sunset times disrupt established routines and make planning increasingly difficult. Your role as household manager requires constant attention to candle inventory and consumption patterns. Each candle must be carefully trimmed to ensure efficient burning, while partially burned stubs are saved and combined with fresh wicks to extract maximum value from every ounce of tallow. Damaged or defective candles are returned to the chandler when possible, though such negotiations often involve compromise between customer satisfaction and merchant profit margins. Storage of candles requires dry, cool conditions that protect them from rodents, insects, and temperature fluctuations that could affect their burning characteristics. The technical challenges of using medieval candles influence every aspect of your home's evening activities. Wicks require regular trimming to prevent excessive smoking and ensure steady flames. But this maintenance must be balanced against the risk of accidentally extinguishing the candle and losing precious light. Candle holders must be carefully positioned to prevent wax dripping on valuable furniture or documents while ensuring adequate illumination for specific tasks. The heat generated by multiple candles can create uncomfortable conditions in small rooms. Yet spreading candles throughout the house multiplies costs without necessarily improving overall lighting quality. Fire safety concerns add another layer of complexity to household lighting decisions. Every lit candle represents a potential disaster that could destroy not only your family's possessions, but potentially spread to neighboring buildings in York's crowded urban environment. Medieval houses, constructed primarily of wood and thatch, offered little resistance to accidental fires, while the limited firefighting capabilities of urban communities meant that blazes often consumed entire neighborhoods. The constant vigilance required to prevent candle-related fires creates ongoing stress and limits the contexts in which artificial lighting can be safely employed. Your relationship with the local chandlers involves ongoing negotiation between quality, price, and service. Guild-certified chandlers offer products of predictable quality backed by professional reputation. but their prices reflect the overhead costs of guild membership and regulatory compliance. Independent producers or households engaged in part-time candle production might offer lower prices, but their products often burn irregularly, produce excessive smoke, or fail prematurely. Bulk purchasing provides some price advantages, but requires significant upfront investment and adequate storage facilities to prevent deterioration before use. The psychological impact of living with rationed light affects your family's social dynamics and individual behavior in subtle but significant ways. Evening conversations tend to be brief and focused, as extended discussions seem wasteful when conducted by expensive candlelight. Leisure activities are postponed until daylight. Hours are abandoned altogether when they cannot be justified against the cost of illumination. The constant awareness of light as a precious resource creates an underlying tension that influences decision-making throughout the household. From the timing of meals to the scheduling of domestic tasks, your position within York's merchant community requires careful balance between maintaining appropriate social standards and managing household expenses within practical limits. Other merchant families face similar challenges, creating informal competition over who can afford the most lavish lighting for social occasions, while simultaneously fostering cooperation in finding suppliers, sharing bulk purchase opportunities, and exchanging information about candle quality and pricing. These relationships highlight the extent to which artificial lighting has become not merely a practical necessity, but a symbol of social status and economic success. As winter approaches and the days grow shorter, you find yourself confronting the annual reckoning that every medieval household must face. How much of your family's limited resources can be justified in the pursuit of light? The approaching months will test not only your financial planning, but your family's adaptability, ingenuity, and willingness to accept the constraints that darkness imposes on daily life. The candle flickering on your table represents more than simple illumination and embodies the ongoing struggle between human ambition and natural limitations that defines medieval existence. But the true complexity of your household's relationship with artificial lighting extends beyond mere economics into questions of social obligation, family welfare, and the fundamental choices that shape medieval domestic life. The intricate social choreography that governed the use of artificial lighting in your merchant household reflected broader patterns of power, status, and obligation that structured all aspects of medieval life. As the wife of a wool merchant, you occupied a position that required careful navigation between the expectations of your social peers and the practical limitations imposed by your family's finances. Every lighting decision carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate cost of candles, touching on questions of hospitality, reputation, and your family's position within York's complex urban hierarchy. Your households lighting practices served as visible markers of social status that were carefully observed and evaluated by neighbors, business associates, and potential marriage partners for your children. When prominent merchants visited Edmund for evening business discussions, the quality and quantity of illumination in your main hall communicated messages about your family's prosperity, sophistication, and commitment to conducting affairs according to appropriate social standards. A dimly lit room suggested either financial distress or social inexperience, while excessive illumination might be interpreted as wasteful ostentation that violated medieval norms of appropriate display. The servants who worked in your household, cook Margaret, who came daily to prepare meals, and young Peter, who assisted with heavy cleaning and errands, operated within their own complex relationship to artificial lighting that reflected their subordinate positions within the domestic hierarchy. Margaret worked primarily during daylight hours, when natural illumination through the kitchen's small windows provided adequate light for food preparation. When evening duties required her presence, she worked by the borrowed light of candles lit for the family's use, never presuming to light additional candles for her own convenience, unless specifically authorized by you. Peter's responsibilities included the maintenance of your household's modest collection of candle holders, oil lamps, and other lighting equipment tasks that provided him with intimate knowledge of your family's consumption patterns and lighting priorities. His discretion regarding these household details was essential to maintaining your social position, as servants' gossip could quickly spread information about merchant families' financial circumstances throughout York's interconnected community of trades, people, and small merchants. The gendered aspects of lighting management placed primary responsibility on you as the household's female authority, reflecting medieval assumptions about women's roles in domestic resource allocation and family welfare. Your decisions about when to light candles, how many to burn simultaneously, and which activities justified artificial illumination directly affected your family's economic stability and social reputation. The skill required to balance these competing demands was recognized within merchant class culture as a crucial component of successful household management, distinguishing competent wives from those whose poor judgment endangered their families. Prosperity. Your children's education in the proper use of artificial lighting began early and encompassed both practical skills and social awareness. Thomas, as your elder son and potential heir to Edmund's business, needed to understand not only the financial implications of lighting decisions, but also the social expectations that would govern his future household management. His evening instruction often took place by candlelight, making the cost of his education literally visible and reinforcing lessons about the value of learning and the sacrifices required to maintain social position. Alice's instruction focused more heavily on the practical aspects of household lighting management, how to trim wicks for optimal burning, how to assess candle quality when making purchases, how to calculate lighting needs for various social occasions. These skills would prove essential when she married and assumed responsibility for her own household's illumination needs. The knowledge she gained from observing your daily decisions would influence her family's economic stability and social success throughout her adult life. The religious dimensions of artificial lighting created additional complications for your household's resource allocation. Church attendance during evening services required personal illumination for safety while traveling through York's dark streets, as well as contributions of candles for liturgical purposes. Religious festivals demanded particularly generous lighting displays as expressions of piety and community participation. The cost of meeting these religious obligations competed with secular lighting needs while remaining virtually mandatory for maintaining your family's position within the Christian community. Your household's relationship with York's Guild of Chandlers involved ongoing negotiation between quality expectations and price considerations. Guild membership provided chandlers with exclusive rights to produce and sell candles within the city. But this monopoly also limited your options when seeking competitive pricing or alternative products. The Guild's quality standards offered some protection against inferior merchandise. Yet these same standards increased production costs that were ultimately passed on to customers like your family. The seasonal rhythms of urban life created predictable patterns in your household's lighting consumption that required careful financial planning. Winter months brought not only increased illumination needs, but also social obligations that peaked during the darkest periods of the year. Christmas celebrations, New Year festivities, and various saints' days all demanded lighting displays that demonstrated appropriate religious observance and community participation. The confluence of maximum lighting needs with increased costs for heating, food, and other winter necessities created annual financial pressures that tested every merchant household's resource management abilities. Your family's lighting practices were influenced by technological innovations that gradually improved the quality and efficiency of artificial illumination. Improvements in wick design reduced smoking and extended burning times, while advances in tallow processing created candles that burned more steadily and produced less offensive odors. However, these technological benefits typically came at premium prices that limited their accessibility to wealthy households, creating lighting hierarchies that paralleled broader social stratification. The competitive dynamics among York's merchant. Families created informal pressure to maintain lighting standards that reflected appropriate social status. Families that economized too aggressively on illumination risked social isolation as business associates and potential. Marriage partners questioned their financial stability or commitment to maintaining proper appearances. Conversely, families that displayed excessive lighting faced criticism for wasteful extravagance that violated community. Norms about appropriate consumption levels. Your household's evening routines evolved around the careful management of expensive deciding, with family activities scheduled to maximize the utility of each candle burned. Shared activities that brought family members together around a single light source. Storytelling, music, or discussion of the day's events provided both economic efficiency and social benefits that reinforced family bonds. Individual activities that required personal illumination were carefully evaluated against their cost and importance. With reading, writing, and detailed needlework competing for priority in the limited budget allocated to evening lighting. The psychological effects of living with rationed illumination influenced your family's relationship to darkness and light in ways that extended far beyond mere economics. The daily transition from natural daylight to expensive artificial lighting created heightened awareness of time's passage and resource consumption that shaped decision-making throughout the household. Evening activities acquired special significance precisely because they required costly illumination, making time spent by candlelight feel both precious and precarious. International trade connections gradually introduced alternative lighting technologies that began to influence local markets and household practices. Oil lamps offered some advantages over candles in specific applications, while imported waxes provided superior burning characteristics for households that could afford premium prices. These alternatives expanded the range of lighting options available to merchant families while complicating the decision-making process for household managers who needed to evaluate new technologies against familiar practices. The long-term implications of your household's lighting decisions extended beyond immediate economic considerations to encompass questions about children's education, business development, and social mobility that would influence your family's trajectory for generations. The balance you achieved between lighting, economy, and social necessity would help determine whether your children could maintain or improve upon their inherited social position, making every evening's candlelighting decision a small but significant contribution to your family's future prospects. But as winter deepened and the demands of darkness pressed ever more heavily upon your household's resources, the true test of your lighting management would reveal itself in ways that challenged not only your economic planning, but your family's very survival through the harsh months ahead. The arrival of November brought with it the harsh arithmetic of survival that governed every aspect of medieval life, as shortened daylight hours transformed your household's lighting needs from manageable expense to existential challenge. By the Feast of All Saints, sunset arrived before the completion of afternoon tasks, forcing impossible choices between productivity and economy that would define your family's experience. Throughout the coming months, the single candle that had seemed adequate during autumn evenings now appeared woefully insufficient for the extended darkness that stretched from late afternoon until dawn. Yet multiplying your illumination would consume resources needed for heating, food, and the 100 other expenses that winter imposed upon urban households. Edmund's wool business faced seasonal pressures that compounded your household's lighting challenges in ways that threatened both immediate comfort and long-term prosperity. The wool trade operated on cycles that concentrated most business activity during warmer months when transportation was reliable and rural producers could deliver their goods to urban markets. Winter brought reduced income precisely when household expenses reached their annual peak, creating a financial squeeze that forced painful decisions about every expenditure. including artificial lighting. Your evening routine evolved into an elaborate choreography designed to extract maximum utility from minimal illumination. As darkness fell, family members gathered around the single candle burning on the main table, organizing their activities to share its precious light. Thomas practiced his Latin lessons by reciting from memory rather than reading from expensive books that might be damaged by wax drippings. Alice worked on simple needlework that required less precise vision than the elaborate embroidery she pursued during daylight hours. Edmund reviewed his account books with the methodical care of someone who understood that mistakes made by inadequate light could prove catastrophic to business relationships built over years of careful cultivation. The physical discomfort of living with minimal lighting extended far beyond simple inconvenience to encompass health challenges that affected every member of your household. Prolonged squinting in dim candlelight caused headaches and eye strain that reduced productivity and created chronic fatigue. The smoke from tallow candles irritated respiratory systems already compromised by winter dampness and poor indoor air quality. Cramped positions necessitated by sharing limited light sources led to muscle soreness and joint stiffness that compounded the general misery of medieval winter life. Your role as household manager required increasingly complex calculations as you balanced competing demands for illumination throughout the long winter evenings. Cooking dinner required light for safe food preparation. Yet extending the meal preparation time to accommodate dim conditions meant burning candles longer and consuming precious resources. Evening, mending, and cleaning tasks essential to household maintenance competed with family social time and children's education for access to expensive artificial lighting. Religious observances demanded proper illumination for prayers and devotional reading. Yet these spiritual necessities strained resources needed for secular activities. The social obligations that had seemed manageable during autumn became overwhelming burdens as winter progressed. Business associates still expected appropriate hospitality when conducting evening meetings, but providing adequate illumination for their comfort could consume a week's worth of your lighting budget in a single night. Religious festivals continue to demand generous candle contributions. Despite your household's increasingly strained finances, neighborhood social customs required reciprocal entertainment that demonstrated community participation and maintained important social relationships taught the servants who worked in your household faced their own complex relationship with winter lighting limitations. Margaret's cooking responsibilities became increasingly challenging as daylight hours shortened, forcing her to begin food preparation earlier in the day or work by borrowed candlelight that was not provided for her benefit. Peter's evening duties included banking, the hearth fire, and securing the house for night tasks that required minimal lighting but could not be safely performed in complete darkness. Their awareness of your family's lighting constraints created additional social dynamics as they carefully avoided any actions that might necessitate additional candle use. Your children's education suffered under the restrictions imposed by expensive artificial lighting, creating long-term implications that extended far beyond immediate inconvenience. Thomas's preparation for potential advancement in Edmund's business required mathematical skills and literacy that could not be adequately developed through daytime instruction alone. Evening tutorial sessions became luxury expenditures that competed with heating, fuel, and food purchases for priority in your household. Budget. Alice's domestic education faced similar challenges as practical skills. Requiring detailed work had to be compressed into increasingly limited daylight hours. The health implications of living with inadequate lighting during winter months created cascading problems that threatened your family's economic stability and social position. Reduced visibility increased the risk of accidents that could result in injury, property damage, or loss of valuable materials. Compromised air quality from excessive reliance on single light sources contributed to respiratory ailments that reduced productivity and required expensive medical treatment. The psychological stress of constant resource rationing created tension within the household that affected decision-making and family relationships. Your household's heating system created complex interactions with lighting needs that multiplied winter expense in unpredictable ways. The main hearth provided both warmth and minimal illumination, but its light was inadequate for detailed work and created flickering shadows that made precision tasks dangerous. Maintaining adequate heating required constant feeding of expensive fuel, yet economizing on heat made evening activities uncomfortable even when adequate lighting was available. The choice between warmth and illumination became a daily negotiation that highlighted the broader resource constraints facing medieval households. The storage and preservation of your candle inventory presented ongoing challenges that affected both immediate availability and long-term planning. Cold temperatures made tallow candles harder and more brittle, increasing breakage rates and waste. Damp conditions encouraged mold growth that could ruin stored candles before they could be used. Rodents seeking food sources during winter months often damaged candle supplies, creating unexpected shortages at times when replacements were most expensive and difficult to obtain. Your relationship with York's chandlers became increasingly strained as winter demand drove up prices while your household's ability to pay declined. Guild-certified producers offered credit arrangements for established customers, but these accommodations came with interest charges that increased overall costs. Independent chandlers sometimes provided better prices for cash purchases, yet their products often proved inferior when subjected to intensive winter use. The choice between quality and affordability became acute when lighting failures could leave your family in dangerous darkness. The broader economic impacts of lighting scarcity affected Tychest, Edmund's business relationships, and your family's long-term prospects in ways that extended far beyond immediate winter survival. Business associates who observed your household's lighting limitations might question Edmund's financial stability and creditworthiness. Reduced evening productivity limited his ability to maintain correspondence, update records, and plan business activities that could improve your family's economic position. Social isolation resulting from inability to provide appropriate evening hospitality could damage relationships essential to business success and children's marriage prospects. International trade disruptions during winter months affected the availability and pricing of lighting materials in ways that local chandlers could not control. Transportation difficulties increased costs for imported materials while reducing competition from external suppliers. Political instabilities could interrupt supply chains and create artificial scarcities that drove up prices beyond the reach of middle-class households. Military campaigns required requisitions of materials, including tallow and wax, that reduced civilian supplies and increased market prices. The cumulative effects of winter lighting constraints created feedback loops that intensified resource pressures throughout the cold months. Reduced evening productivity meant that tasks accumulated during winter required intensive effort during spring and summer months when daylight was abundant. Health problems resulting from inadequate lighting created medical expenses that reduced resources available for other necessities. Social isolation caused by inability to maintain appropriate lighting standards weakened relationships that could provide assistance during financial emergencies. As winter deepened toward its darkest months, your household's struggle with lighting scarcity revealed the fundamental tensions between human aspirations and natural limitations that characterized medieval life. The daily battle against darkness represented more than simple economic challenge. It embodied the broader human effort to create spaces of warmth, productivity, and social connection within a world that seemed designed to frustrate such ambitions. Your family's survival through the winter would depend not only on careful resource management, but on the resilience, ingenuity, and mutual support that enabled medieval communities to persist despite the enormous challenges they faced. The approach of Christmas brought both hope for seasonal celebration and anxiety about the additional lighting expenses that religious and social obligations would demand, creating a final test of your household's ability to balance survival with the cultural expectations that defined civilized life in medieval England. You are Brother Augustine, keeper of the scriptorium at the Great Abbey of St. Albans. And as you guide your quill across the vellum surface of an illuminated psalter, the dozen tallow candles arranged around your writing desk create a constellation of flickering flames that transforms your workspace into a paradox of creation and destruction. Each candle represents hours of careful planning, precious resources allocated by the abbot for the continuation of your sacred work. Yet each flame also embodies a potential catastrophe that could reduce centuries of accumulated knowledge to ash in a matter of minutes. The irony is not lost on you that the very illumination required to preserve divine wisdom poses the greatest threat to its survival. The scriptorium of St. Albans houses one of medieval England's most precious collections of manuscripts, books, and documents, irreplaceable treasures that chronicle not only religious doctrine, but secular knowledge accumulated over generations of scholarly labor. Your daily work involves copying, correcting, and illuminating texts that will outlive you by centuries. Yet this vital preservation effort depends entirely upon artificial lighting that could destroy in moments what has taken lifetimes to create. The precarious balance between illumination and incineration defines every aspect of your monastic duties, creating constant tension between scholarly necessity and catastrophic risk. The technical challenges of maintaining adequate lighting in the scriptorium require skills that extend far beyond simple literacy and calligraphy. Each candle must be carefully positioned to provide optimal illumination, while minimizing the risk of wax dripping onto precious manuscripts or flame contact with flammable materials. The wicks require constant trimming to prevent excessive smoking that could damage parchment or make detailed work impossible. Candle holders must be stable enough to prevent tipping while positioned close enough to the work surface to provide adequate light for the intricate detail work that illuminated manuscripts demand. Your daily routine begins before dawn with a careful inspection of the scriptorium's fire safety arrangements, responsibility that carries implications far beyond personal convenience. Water vessels strategically positioned throughout the room provide immediate response capability in case of accidental ignition. Sand buckets offer backup fire suppression for different types of blazes. Emergency evacuation routes are kept clear of obstacles that might impede rapid removal of valuable manuscripts in case of disaster. These preparations reflect hard-won experience with the catastrophic potential of open flames in environments filled with flammable materials. The monastery's archives contain sobering records of disasters that have befallen religious institutions throughout England and continental Europe, providing constant reminders of the dangers inherent in combining artificial lighting with precious manuscripts. Canterbury Cathedral lost portions of its library to fire, started by an overturned oil lamp in 1174. The abbey at Glastonbury suffered devastating damage when sparks from inadequately maintained candles ignited stored parchment in 1184. These historical precedents inform every lighting decision made within your scriptorium, creating awareness that even momentary carelessness could produce consequences that would reverberate through generations. The economic implications of fire safety measures in the scriptorium compete directly with resource constraints that limit the monastery's ability to invest in adequate protection. Fire-resistant storage containers for the most valuable manuscripts require expensive materials and skilled craftsmanship that strain the abbey's budget. Specialized candle holders designed to minimize fire risk cost significantly more than simple pottery or wooden alternatives. Additional lighting supplies maintained as backup inventory represent capital investment that could otherwise be used for manuscript acquisition, ink, parchment, or other scholarly necessities. The social dynamics within the scriptorium reflect hierarchies that govern both scholarly work and fire safety responsibilities. Senior monks like yourself bear primary accountability for protecting valuable manuscripts, while younger brothers and lay assistants often handle the more dangerous tasks of lighting, extinguishing, and maintaining candles throughout the workspace. These arrangements create complex relationships where intellectual authority must be balanced against physical risk, and scholarly priorities must accommodate safety concerns that could interrupt important work at critical moments. Your position as scriptorium keeper requires constant vigilance regarding the behavior and capabilities of everyone who works within the manuscript copying areas. Brother Marcus, despite his skill with decorative borders and initial letters, tends to become so absorbed in his artistic work that he neglects basic fire safety protocols. Young Brother Thomas sometimes positions candles too close to his writing surface in his eagerness to achieve perfect letter formation. The lay assistant Robert, while reliable in most respects, occasionally trims candle wicks too aggressively, creating flames that burn irregularly and produce dangerous sparks. The seasonal variations in daylight availability create predictable cycles of increased fire risk that require careful planning and additional safety measures. Winter months bring not only extended dependence on artificial lighting, but also increased heating needs that multiply sources of ignition within the scriptorium. Multiple braziers provide necessary warmth for scholars and prevent ink from freezing. Yet these heating sources interact dangerously with the numerous candles required for adequate illumination. The combination of heating and lighting creates indoor environments where fire risk accumulates exponentially rather than additively. The manuscript materials, ignavs, present varying degrees of fire hazard that influence lighting arrangements and safety protocols throughout the workspace. Parchment, while more fire-resistant than paper, still ignites readily when exposed to direct flame contact or excessive heat. The inks used in manuscript preparation often contain flammable components that accelerate fire spread once ignition occurs. Gold leaf and other decorative materials used in illuminated manuscripts can create intense heat when burned, making such fires particularly difficult to extinguish and increasing damage to surrounding materials. Your daily lighting routine involves elaborate preparations designed to minimize risk while providing adequate illumination for detailed scholarly work. Each morning begins with inspection of all candle holders for stability and proper positioning. Wicks are trimmed to optimal length and tested for even burning characteristics. Candles are selected based on quality standards that emphasize steady burning and minimal dripping rather than simply lowest cost. The arrangement of lighting sources reflects careful consideration of workflow, manuscript positioning, and emergency access routes that could prove crucial during crisis situations. The technology available for fire suppression in medieval religious institutions provides limited effectiveness against the types of blazes most likely to occur in manuscript environments. Water, while readily available, can cause damage to parchment and ink that rivals fire destruction in its devastating effects on scholarly work. Sand offers better fire suppression capability without water damage, but requires accurate aim and adequate quantity to be effective against rapidly spreading flames. Specialized fire suppression techniques like smothering with heavy cloth or removing combustible materials from fire paths require training and coordination that may not be available during emergency situations. The psychological stress of working surrounded by potential fire hazards affects the quality and efficiency of scholarly work in ways that extend far beyond simple distraction. Constant awareness of fire risk creates underlying tension that influences decision-making throughout the workday. The need for vigilance regarding lighting safety competes with intellectual concentration required for accurate copying and artistic creation. Fear of causing catastrophic damage can paralyze decision-making and reduce productivity, while overconfidence about fire safety can lead to complacency that increases actual risk levels. The religious dimensions of fire Risk in monastic environments. Create theological questions that complicate practical safety decisions. Divine providence traditionally protected holy places and sacred objects. Yet experience demonstrated that God's protection did not exempt religious institutions from the natural consequences of human carelessness. The tension between faith and divine protection and prudent preparation for disaster reflected broader questions about the relationship between spiritual and material concerns that influenced every aspect of monastic life. Your scriptorium's relationship with the broader monastery community involves complex negotiations about resource allocation, risk tolerance, and priority setting that affect fire safety capabilities. The abbot must balance manuscript preservation against other institutional needs, including charity, hospitality, building maintenance, and agricultural operations. Fellow monks who do not work directly with manuscripts sometimes question the elaborate fire safety measures employed in the scriptorium, viewing them as excessive caution that wastes resources. These internal dynamics create ongoing pressure to justify safety expenditures, while maintaining adequate protection for irreplaceable scholarly materials. The architectural features of medieval, monastic buildings present both advantages and disadvantages. For manuscript fire safety, that influenced daily operational decisions. Stone construction provides some protection against fire spread, yet narrow windows limit natural lighting and increase dependence on artificial illumination. High ceilings allow smoke to rise away from work surfaces, but make it difficult to detect small fires before they spread. Thick walls provide fire resistance, but also limit ventilation that could remove dangerous fumes from candle and ink combustion. As evening approaches and the last light fades from your scriptorium's small windows, you face the daily choice that embodies the fundamental tension of medieval intellectual life. Whether to continue working by expensive and dangerous artificial light or surrender to darkness and lose precious hours of scholarly productivity. The manuscript before you, a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew that has occupied your attention for months, requires completion before the approaching winter makes detailed work impossible. Yet every moment spent working by candlelight increases the probability of disaster that could destroy not only your current project, but centuries of accumulated scholarship. But the true complexity of fire risk in medieval manuscript environments extends far beyond individual caution to encompass systemic vulnerabilities that threaten the preservation of knowledge itself. The vulnerability of medieval manuscript collections to fire-related disasters reflected systemic problems that extended far beyond individual carelessness or inadequate safety measures, encompassing architectural limitations, technological constraints, and institutional practices that created environments where catastrophic loss remained perpetually imminent. Your experience as scriptorium keeper at St. Albans provided daily reminders that even the most careful fire safety protocols could not eliminate risks inherent in the basic requirements of scholarly work, creating a precarious balance between intellectual achievement and physical preservation that characterized medieval monastery life. The architectural design of monastic buildings, while providing many advantages for scholarly work, incorporated features that inadvertently increased fire risks in ways that became apparent only through bitter experience. The thick stone walls that protected manuscripts from external threats also limited ventilation that could remove dangerous accumulations of combustible gases from candle combustion and ink preparation. Small windows that preserved valuable interior space for manuscript storage simultaneously restricted natural lighting and increased dependence on artificial illumination throughout longer periods of each day. High ceilings that provided impressive spaces for worship created air currents that could spread small fires rapidly throughout large interior volumes. Before suppression efforts could prove effective, the concentration of flammable materials within Limited spaces multiplied fire risks exponentially rather than additively, creating environments where small ignition sources could generate catastrophic results. Manuscript collections stored in wooden cabinets or boxes created continuous fuel loads that allowed fires to spread rapidly from room to room within monastic complexes. Ink preparation materials, including alcohol, oils, and various organic compounds, provided accelerants that intensified blazes beyond the suppression capabilities of medieval firefighting techniques. Parchment and paper stored in quantities necessary for large-scale manuscript production created tinderbox conditions where single sparks could ignite enough material to sustain major conflagrati and stot the daily routines of monastic scholarship, created predictable patterns of fire risk that accumulated throughout typical working periods in ways that made disasters increasingly probable as time passed. Morning lighting rituals involve simultaneous ignition of multiple candles throughout the scriptorium, creating peak periods when human error or equipment failure could have maximum impact. Midday ink preparation activities introduced volatile chemicals into environments already containing numerous open flames from ongoing manuscript work. Evening completion of urgent projects often involved extended periods of intensive artificial lighting when fatigue and time pressure reduced attention to safety protocols. Your observations of fire safety practices throughout the broader monastic community revealed troubling variations in risk awareness and preventive measures that reflected differences in leadership priorities, available resources, and institutional experience with actual disasters. Some monasteries maintained elaborate fire suppression equipment and trained personnel to respond to emergencies, while others relied primarily on divine protection and basic precautionary measures. These differences created network effects throughout the scholarly community as manuscript exchanges, collaborative projects, and shared resources could introduce materials from institutions with inadequate fire safety into environments with superior protection. The economic factors that influenced fire safety decisions in monastic environments created perverse incentives that often increased risks in the name of resource conservation. Quality candles that burned steadily with minimal smoking cost, significantly more than cheaper alternatives that produced irregular flames and dangerous sparks. Fire-resistant storage containers required initial investments that competed with manuscript acquisition, building maintenance, and charitable obligations. For limited institutional resources, specialized firefighting equipment represented capital expenditures that provided no immediate benefits and might never be needed, making them difficult to justify against more pressing operational needs. The human factors that contributed to fire risks in manuscript environments reflected both individual psychology and institutional culture in ways that proved resistant to technological or procedural solutions. Scholarly work required sustained concentration that could lead to dangerous inattention to lighting safety, particularly during periods when important projects demanded completion under tight deadlines. The familiarity with fire hazards that came through daily exposure sometimes bred complacency rather than heightened caution, as repeated safe outcomes created false confidence about risk levels. Competition between monastic scholars for recognition and advancement could encourage risk-taking behaviors that prioritized productive output over safety considerations. The seasonal and weather-related factors that affected fire safety in monastic environments created predictable cycles of elevated risk that required coordinated responses beyond individual vigilance. Winter months brought not only increased dependence on artificial lighting, but also heating systems that multiplied ignition sources throughout monastic complexes. Dry summer conditions made all flammable materials more susceptible to ignition, while reducing the effectiveness of water-based fire suppression techniques. Storm periods that disrupted normal routines could create emergency conditions where safety protocols were abandoned in favor of expedient responses to immediate crises. The technological limitations of medieval fire. Suppression equipment created. Response capabilities that were often inadequate to contain blazes once they achieved significant size or intensity. Hand-operated water pumps required multiple personnel and provided limited flow rates that could not match the consumption rates of large fires. Leather fire buckets deteriorated rapidly under intensive use and could not be effectively organized for coordinated firefighting efforts without extensive training and leadership. Sand and dirt suppression techniques worked well for small fires, but proved ineffective against blazes that had spread to multiple locations or involved highly flammable materials, like oils and alcohol. The institutional dynamics within monastic communities affected fire safety preparedness through complex interactions between spiritual and temporal concerns that sometimes created conflicting priorities. Religious leaders who emphasized divine protection might resist investments in temporal fire safety measures, viewing such expenditures as evidence of insufficient faith. Scholarly priorities that focused on manuscript acquisition and intellectual production could overshadow safety concerns, particularly when immediate risks seemed low compared to long-term institutional goals. Administrative complexities within large monastic institutions could delay decision-making about fire safety improvements while risks continue to accumulate throughout daily operations. Your personal experience with near-disaster incidents provided sobering insights into how quickly controllable situations could escalate into potential catastrophes despite careful preparation and vigilant attention to safety protocols. The morning when Brother Marcus knocked over a candle while reaching for a manuscript demonstrated how routine movements could create emergency situations without warning or obvious cause. The afternoon when defective candle wick produced unusual sparks that ignited ink preparation materials showed how equipment failures could overwhelm even careful safety arrangements. These incidents highlighted the narrow margins between normal operations and disaster that characterized all activities involving open flames in manuscript environments. The network effects of fire disasters within the broader medieval scholarly community created vulnerabilities that extended far beyond individual institutional boundaries. Major manuscript collections destroyed by fire often contained unique copies of works that existed nowhere else, creating permanent losses for all of medieval Christendom. Collaborative scholarly projects that depended on materials from multiple institutions could be disrupted by fire disasters at any participating monastery. The concentration of certain specialized knowledge within vulnerable collections meant that entire fields of study could be set back decades or centuries by single, catastrophic events. The documentation of historical fire disasters at religious institutions throughout Europe provided disturbing evidence of the frequency and severity of manuscript losses that had already occurred by your lifetime. The library at Monte Cassino suffered repeated fire damage during the 11th and 12th centuries, destroying works by classical authors that were never recovered. Manuscript collections at various cathedrals and abbeys throughout France had experienced catastrophic losses that eliminated entire categories of historical and theological documents. These precedents created awareness that fire risk represented not just local institutional concerns, but threats to the preservation of knowledge itself throughout medieval civilization. The long-term implications of fire vulnerability in manuscript environments affected scholarly strategies, institutional policies, and intellectual development in ways that influence the entire trajectory of medieval learning. Risk-averse institutions might avoid acquiring unique or controversial works that represented higher stakes in case of fire loss. Collaborative scholarly projects could be structured to distribute risks across multiple locations, reducing efficiency, while improving preservation odds. The constant awareness of potential catastrophic loss influenced scholarly priorities and working methods in ways that shaped intellectual development throughout the medieval period. As winter darkness deepened around the abbey and your dependence on dangerous artificial lighting reached its annual peak, You confronted the sobering reality that fire safety in medieval manuscript environments represented an inherently unsolvable problem, where technological limitations, economic constraints, and institutional priorities created systematic vulnerabilities that no amount of individual caution could entirely eliminate. But the true measure of these risks would become apparent only when disaster struck, revealing the devastating consequences that awaited medieval scholarship when the precarious balance between illumination and preservation finally collapsed. The catastrophic fire that struck the Abbey of St. Albans on the night of December 15th began, like most medieval disasters, with a moment of ordinary carelessness that escalated beyond all proportion to its humble origins. Brother Thomas, working late to complete a Christmas sermon translation, failed to properly secure a candle holder as he reached for a reference text, and the slight jarring of his writing desk caused the burning tallow candle to topple onto a pile of fresh parchment sheets awaiting illumination. Within seconds, the parchment ignited with surprising intensity, and within minutes, flames had spread to wooden storage cabinets containing decades of scholarly work that would never be recovered or replaced. Your response to the alarm bells that shattered the Abbey's evening quiet demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of medieval fire safety preparations. Racing through the corridors toward the scriptorium, you encountered clouds of acrid smoke that made navigation difficult and breathing dangerous. The water buckets positioned throughout the monastic complex proved inadequate for the rapidly spreading blaze, while sand supplies were quickly exhausted attempting to smother flames that had already spread beyond the capacity of manual suppression techniques. Your desperate efforts to evacuate valuable manuscripts from threatened areas saved some treasures but required agonizing choices about which irreplaceable works could be rescued and which would be abandoned to the advancing flames. The fire's progression through the Abbey's interconnected buildings revealed architectural vulnerabilities that had never been apparent during routine operations. Stone walls that had seemed to provide fire protection actually conducted heat that ignited wooden structural elements and storage materials in adjacent rooms before flames physically reached those spaces. Narrow corridors that facilitated quiet movement during regular activities became bottlenecks that impeded evacuation efforts and prevented effective firefighting access to critical areas. The high ceilings that created impressive worship spaces allowed smoke and heat to accumulate in ways that made rescue operations increasingly dangerous as the fire progressed. Brother Thomas, whose momentary lapse had initiated the catastrophe, suffered burns on his hands and arms while attempting to smother the initial flames. But his injuries paled beside the psychological trauma that would affect him throughout his remaining years at the monastery. His immediate confession of responsibility, delivered through tears and smoke inhalation, highlighted the personal dimensions of disasters that official records would document only in terms of material losses and institutional damage. The burden of knowing that his carelessness had destroyed centuries of accumulated scholarship created spiritual and emotional wounds that proved more lasting than his physical injuries. The community's response to the unfolding disaster demonstrated both the solidarity and the limitations that characterized medieval institutional crisis management. Monks, lay brothers, and local townspeople formed human chains to pass water buckets and evacuate threatened materials. Yet their heroic efforts remained fundamentally inadequate against the scale of destruction that medieval fires could achieve once they gained momentum. Religious services were suspended as prayer gave way to desperate physical action, though some community members maintained that divine intervention represented the only realistic hope for preserving the Abbey's scholarly treasures. The economic implications of the fire became apparent even as flames continued to consume irreplaceable manuscripts and threaten additional buildings throughout the monastic complex. The immediate costs of fighting the blaze water, sand, damaged equipment, Medical care for injured participants represented substantial expenditures that strained the Abbey's financial resources. The longer-term costs of replacing destroyed manuscripts, rebuilding damaged structures, and maintaining operations while reconstruction proceeded threatened the institution's economic viability and could force reduction in charitable activities, educational programs, and scholarly pursuits that defined the Abbey's mission. The intellectual losses suffered during those terrible hours reflected the vulnerability of medieval knowledge preservation systems to catastrophic disruption that could set back human learning by decades or centuries. Unique copies of historical chronicles documenting local events and personalities vanished forever, creating gaps in the historical record that would never be filled. Theological commentaries representing years of scholarly analysis were reduced to ash, eliminating contributions to religious understanding that had taken lifetimes to develop. Scientific and mathematical works that had been slowly copied and preserved for future study disappeared, forcing scholars to recreate knowledge from fragmentary sources or abandon entire lines of investigation. Your personal losses during the fire extended beyond professional disappointment to encompass spiritual and emotional trauma that would influence your remaining years of monastic service. The Psalter illumination project that had occupied months of careful work was completely destroyed, eliminating not only the immediate artistic achievement, but also the prospect of completing a devotional work intended as a contribution to the Abbey's liturgical life. Personal notes and research materials accumulated over years of study were lost, forcing you to begin rebuilding intellectual foundations that had taken decades to establish. The fire's impact on the broader scholarly community became apparent. In the days and weeks following the immediate disaster, as other institutions learned of the losses suffered at St. Albans and reflected on their own vulnerabilities to similar catastrophes, manuscript lending programs that had facilitated collaborative research were suspended as institutions became reluctant to risk their unique holdings through transportation to potentially unsafe environments. Scholarly correspondence networks experienced disruption as researchers lost reference materials needed to continue intellectual exchanges. The concentration of certain types of knowledge within vulnerable collections became a recognized threat to the preservation of medieval learning. The investigation into the fire's causes and progression revealed systematic problems that extended beyond individual carelessness to encompass institutional policies and technological assail. Limitations that had created conditions favorable to catastrophic loss. Inadequate spacing between manuscript storage areas had allowed rapid fire spread between collections that should have been isolated from each other. Insufficient ventilation had created smoke accumulation that impeded evacuation and suppression efforts while intensifying heat damage to materials beyond the direct reach of flames. Outdated fire suppression equipment had proven inadequate for the scale of emergency that modern medieval institutions might reasonably expect to encounter. The rebuilding process that followed the immediate disaster required difficult decisions about institutional priorities, resource allocation, and risk tolerance that would influence the Abbey's character and mission for generations to come. Investments in fire-resistant construction competed with manuscript replacement for limited financial resources, forcing choices between present safety and future scholarly capability. New fire safety protocols required training and equipment that consumed time and money previously devoted to intellectual pursuits. The design of replacement facilities incorporated lessons learned from the disaster, but also reflected technological and economic constraints that prevented complete elimination of fire risks. The psychological impact of the catastrophe on the monastic community extended far beyond immediate grief over material losses to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between divine providence and human responsibility in protecting sacred knowledge. Some community members interpreted the fire as divine judgment on institutional pride or scholarly priorities that had displaced proper spiritual concerns. Others viewed the disaster as a test of faith that required redoubled commitment to preserving and expanding Christian learning despite material setbacks. These theological disagreements created internal tensions that affected community unity and institutional decision-making during the crucial recovery period. The broader implications of the St. Albans fire for medieval knowledge preservation became apparent as other institutions modified their practices in response to lessons learned from the disaster. Manuscript copying programs expanded to create redundant copies of important works stored in separate locations, reducing risks associated with single-point failures. Collaborative preservation networks emerged to share fire safety information and coordinate emergency responses across institutional boundaries. Investment in fire suppression technology increased throughout the monastic community, though resource constraints limited the extent of improvements that individual institutions could implement. The documentary evidence of the fire's impact provides sobering testimony to the fragility of knowledge preservation in medieval environments and the catastrophic potential of everyday risks that accumulated through routine scholarly activities. Official records list hundreds of manuscripts destroyed, including works that had survived since ancient times and represented irreplaceable links to classical civilization. Personal accounts describe the psychological trauma experienced by scholars who witnessed lifetimes of intellectual achievement reduced to ash within hours. Financial documents revealed the enormous costs of recovery efforts that would influence institutional operations for decades. As spring arrived and reconstruction efforts gradually restored the Abbey's capacity for scholarly work. The full measure of the December fire's impact on medieval learning continued to unfold through the recognition of specific losses that would affect intellectual development throughout Europe. Historical chronicles that had provided unique perspectives on early English history were gone forever, creating gaps in historical understanding that modern scholarship still struggles to fill. Theological works that had influenced religious thought and practice throughout the medieval period were lost, forcing reconstruction of philosophical arguments from fragmentary secondary sources. Scientific and mathematical treatises that had preserved ancient knowledge and medieval innovations disappeared, setting back technical and intellectual progress in fields where advancement had already been slow and difficult. The fire at St. Albans represented more than an isolated institutional disaster, embodied the systematic vulnerabilities that threatened knowledge preservation throughout medieval civilization, and highlighted the precarious balance between illumination and destruction that characterized all scholarly work in an age when artificial light remained both essential and lethal. You are Master William D. Ashby, a successful mason whose expertise in stone and timber construction has earned you contracts throughout Yorkshire. And as you stand in the courtyard of Sir Geoffrey's new manor house, examining the architectural plans spread across a makeshift table, the December afternoon light fades so rapidly that you can barely read your own carefully drawn specifications. The irony strikes you immediately. You are designing a home meant to shelter human life and activity. Yet the fundamental challenge of providing adequate illumination within that shelter remains an afterthought, addressed through architectural compromises that will shape every aspect of domestic life for generations to come. The manor house taking shape before you represents the pinnacle of 13th century domestic architecture. Yet its design reflects a fundamental tension between competing necessities that characterizes all medieval construction. The thick stone walls required for defense and structural integrity create interior spaces that remain perpetually dim even during the brightest summer days. The small windows necessary for security and heat retention admit so little natural light that detailed work becomes impossible once the sun moves beyond their narrow apertures. The high ceilings that demonstrate noble status and provide impressive interior volumes also create vast spaces that require enormous quantities of artificial lighting to achieve even minimal illumination levels. Your professional reputation depends Upon balancing these competing demands in ways that satisfy both practical requirements and social expectations while remaining within budgetary constraints that reflect medieval economics rather than architectural idealism, Sir Geoffrey requires a home that befits his status as a landed knight, with spaces adequate for entertaining fellow nobles, conducting business affairs, and maintaining the complex household that supports his family and retainers. Yet every architectural decision you make regarding room size, window placement, and interior configuration will directly influence the costs and difficulties that his household faces in providing adequate lighting throughout the structure. The technical challenges of medieval window construction impose severe limitations on natural lighting that force architectural accommodations throughout the entire building design. Glass windows remain luxury items available only to the wealthiest households, and even these expensive installations provide minimal illumination due to the thick, irregular glass and small pane sizes that characterize medieval manufacturing capabilities. Most windows rely on wooden shutters that can be opened for light and air circulation, but must be closed for security and weather protection, creating cycles of illumination and darkness that vary with seasonal and security conditions. The placement of windows requires careful calculation of structural integrity, defensive requirements, and lighting optimization in ways that often produce conflicting recommendations. South-facing windows provide maximum natural light throughout the year, but may compromise defensive positions if the manor faces potential military threats. Large windows admit more light, but weaken wall structures and increase heat loss during winter months. Ground floor windows provide convenient lighting for daily activities, but create security vulnerabilities that could endanger the household during periods of social unrest. Your experience with previous construction projects provides sobering insights into how architectural decisions regarding lighting affect the daily lives of families who will occupy completed structures for decades or centuries. The merchant family whose house you completed in York struggles with inadequate lighting in their main hall, forcing them to conduct evening business meetings by expensive candlelight that strains their household budget. The knight whose manor you built in Lincolnshire discovered that his solar receives insufficient natural light for his wife's needlework, requiring costly artificial illumination during afternoon hours when candles should be unnecessary. The relationship between medieval heating systems and interior lighting creates complex architectural challenges that influence room layouts, ceiling heights, and spatial arrangements throughout domestic structures. Central hearths that provide both heat and illumination require substantial floor space and create smoke conditions that make close proximity uncomfortable despite superior light quality. Wall-mounted fireplaces offer better smoke control and more efficient heating, but provide minimal illumination beyond their immediate vicinity. The choice between central and peripheral heating systems affects traffic patterns, furniture placement, and the practical organization of domestic activities in ways that will influence household operations long after construction is completed. The social expectations that govern medieval domestic architecture impose lighting requirements that reflect status hierarchies rather than practical efficiency, creating buildings where illumination quality varies dramatically between spaces, intended for different social classes. The Great Hall where Sir Geoffrey will receive guests and conduct formal business requires impressive dimensions and decorative features that make adequate lighting expensive and difficult to achieve. Service areas where household staff prepare food and maintain. The property can accept minimal lighting standards that prioritize economy over convenience. Private chambers for the Lord's family occupy a middle ground where modest luxury must be balanced against practical considerations of cost and daily usability. Your architectural drawings reflect these social hierarchies through spatial allocations, window placements, and structural features that prioritize certain activities and social groups over others. The chapel attached to the manor receives multiple windows and optimal southern exposure to ensure adequate natural lighting for religious services and devotional activities. The kitchen and storage areas rely on minimal fenestration and must accommodate working conditions where artificial lighting represents luxury rather than necessity. Guest chambers receive sufficient window access to demonstrate proper hospitality while avoiding the premium costs associated. With elaborate lighting arrangements, the economic factors that influence medieval domestic architecture create ongoing tension between initial construction costs and long-term operational expenses that particularly affect lighting-related decisions. Premium building materials that improve natural lighting transmission, high-quality glass, superior window hardware, specialized stone cutting for larger apertures require substantial upfront investments that may not provide proportional improvements in daily lighting conditions. Construction techniques that optimize natural light often increase structural complexity and require specialized craftsmen whose services demand higher wages than standard building practices. The seasonal variations in natural lighting availability force architectural accommodations that compromise optimal design solutions in favor of arrangements that remain functional throughout the annual cycle. South-facing rooms that receive excellent illumination during summer months may become uncomfortably bright and hot during peak seasons while remaining adequately lit during winter darkness. North-facing spaces that provide comfortable conditions during summer months may become virtually unusable during winter without expensive artificial lighting. Room assignments and traffic patterns must anticipate these seasonal variations to ensure that essential household activities remain possible throughout the year. The technological limitations of medieval artificial lighting systems impose architectural constraints that affect interior design, furniture placement, spatial organization in ways that modern builders rarely consider. Candles and oil lamps require stable surfaces, protection from drafts, and safe distances from flammable materials, yet they provide so little illumination that they must be positioned close to work areas to be effective. Multiple light sources require coordination to avoid interference while ensuring adequate coverage for large spaces. The heat generated by numerous candles or lamps can create uncomfortable conditions that make additional ventilation necessary. Despite potential lighting compromises, your professional relationships with other craftsmen involved in domestic construction reveal the complex interdependencies that affect lighting solutions throughout medieval building projects. Carpenters who construct window frames and interior fixtures must coordinate their work with your stone installations to ensure proper fit and weather sealing. Glaziers who provide glass windows require accurate measurements and secure mounting systems that influence structural design decisions. Metalworkers who fabricate lighting fixtures, hinges, and hardware must understand the architectural context in which their products will be used to ensure appropriate functionality and durability. The regional variations in building materials, construction techniques, and architectural traditions create different approaches to domestic lighting challenges that reflect local conditions, available resources, and cultural preferences. Yorkshire limestone provides excellent structural material but limits window sizes due to weight and engineering constraints. Local timber supplies affect framing possibilities and influence the size and placement of openings that admit natural light. Regional weather patterns determine optimal window orientations and protection requirements that affect lighting availability throughout the year. The legal and regulatory frameworks that govern medieval construction impose additional constraints on architectural lighting solutions through building codes, guild regulations, and municipal ordinances that prioritize safety and social order. Overlighting optimization. Urban building regulations often restrict window sizes and placements to prevent fire spread between adjacent structures, limiting natural lighting in dense settlement areas. Guild standards for construction quality may mandate techniques that improve structural integrity at the expense of lighting efficiency. Municipal ordinances regarding defensive preparations can require architectural features that compromise domestic lighting for broader community security interests. As evening approaches, and you prepare to conclude your planning session with Sir Geoffrey, The rapid onset of darkness provides a stark reminder of the architectural challenges you face in creating a home that must function adequately during the long months when natural lighting becomes scarce and expensive artificial illumination dominates domestic life. The manor house you design will shape not only the physical comfort of its inhabitants, but also their daily routines, social interactions, and economic stability in ways that reflect the fundamental medieval struggle between human aspirations and environmental constraints. But the true test of your architectural decisions will come not in the drawing phase, but in the daily reality of medieval domestic life, where lighting limitations will reveal the success or failure of every spatial choice you make. The completed manor house of Sir Geoffrey presented a complex landscape of illumination and shadow that reflected both architectural intention and the harsh realities of medieval domestic lighting, creating distinct zones within the structure where different activities could be sustained throughout the daily cycle of natural and artificial light. Your construction had succeeded in providing a residence that met contemporary standards for noble housing. Yet the building's internal geography demonstrated how profoundly lighting limitations influenced the organization of medieval domestic space and the patterns of daily life that would unfold within those carefully planned walls. The Great Hall, positioned at the center of your architectural scheme, embodied the fundamental contradictions that characterized medieval attempts to balance social requirements with lighting practicalities. The impressive dimensions necessary for entertaining guests and demonstrating Sir Geoffrey's status created a volume that required dozens of candles to achieve adequate illumination during evening events. Yet the same spaciousness that conveyed nobility also made the room uncomfortable and expensive to light for routine daily activities. The high ceiling that provided visual drama and allowed for elaborate decorative displays also created air currents that caused candles to flicker unpredictably and produced draft conditions that made consistent lighting difficult to maintain. The placement of the hall's windows reflected your careful consideration of lighting requirements, balanced against defensive necessities and structural constraints. The large south-facing window that dominated the hall's exterior wall admitted maximum natural light during winter months when illumination was most precious. Yet its size and position compromised the wall's defensive strength and required expensive glass installation to provide weather protection. The smaller windows positioned on the east and west walls supplemented natural lighting during morning and afternoon hours, but created complex shadow patterns that changed throughout the day, forcing furniture arrangements that accommodated shifting illumination conditions Sir Geoffrey's family adapted their daily routines to accommodate. The hall's lighting characteristics in ways that demonstrated how architectural decisions influenced social behavior and household organization. Morning meals took advantage of optimal natural lighting conditions, while evening dining required expensive artificial illumination that transformed dinner into a carefully budgeted occasion rather than a casual family activity. Business meetings with fellow knights and local officials were scheduled to coincide with peak natural lighting periods when possible. Though winter weather and seasonal daylight variations often forced reliance on costly candles for important discussions, the solar, designed as Sir Geoffrey's private chamber for reading, correspondence, and personal business affairs, represented your most successful attempt to optimize domestic lighting for detailed intellectual work. The room's eastern orientation provided excellent morning illumination for early business activities, while a carefully positioned south window extended useful natural light through midday hours. The chamber's modest dimensions allowed a single high-quality candle to provide adequate evening illumination without the massive expense required for lighting larger spaces, making this room economically viable for extended daily use throughout the year. Lady Margaret's bower, positioned adjacent to the solar, reflected the gendered aspects of medieval domestic architecture and the specific lighting requirements associated with women's household responsibilities. the room's southern exposure, provided optimal natural lighting for the detailed needlework and textile production that formed essential components of noble household management. Multiple smaller windows distributed light more evenly throughout the space than single large apertures, reducing shadow areas that could interfere with precise manual work. The Bowers furnishing arrangements demonstrated how lighting considerations influence domestic interior design, with work tables positioned to capture maximum benefit from available natural light while maintaining access to artificial illumination. When needed, the kitchen, located in a separate building connected to the main hall by covered walkways, presented unique lighting challenges that reflected the utilitarian nature of food preparation activities and the social status of household. Staff who worked in these spaces, large windows on multiple walls provided abundant natural lighting during daylight hours, recognizing that food preparation required good visibility for safety and quality control. However, the kitchen's lighting arrangements assumed that most food preparation would occur during natural daylight, with artificial illumination reserved for emergency situations or special occasions that required cooking during evening hours. The service quarters, housing household staff, demonstrated how social hierarchies influenced architectural lighting decisions through spatial arrangements that prioritized economy over comfort or convenience. Servants' sleeping areas received minimal, natural lighting through small windows that provided basic visibility, while conserving construction costs and maintaining appropriate social distinctions. Common areas where staff gathered for meals or work activities relied on shared lighting arrangements that reflected collective rather than individual resource allocation. These spaces accepted lighting limitations that would have been unacceptable in areas designed for noble family use. The chapel attached to the manor represented your most elaborate attempt to optimize religious lighting through architectural design that accommodated both natural illumination and the ceremonial requirements of Christian worship. East-facing altar windows provided symbolic and practical benefits by admitting morning sunlight during daily prayers while reinforcing religious symbolism associated with light and divine presence. Additional south-facing windows supplemented natural lighting during afternoon religious observances, while the chapel's acoustic design ensured that religious services could be conducted effectively even when lighting conditions were minimal. The storage areas throughout the manor reflected pragmatic approaches to lighting that prioritized security and weather protection over illumination quality, recognizing that many storage activities could be conducted with minimal lighting during brief inspection periods. Cellars and basement areas relied on portable artificial lighting brought from other parts of the building when access was needed, avoiding the expense of permanent lighting installations in spaces used infrequently. Granaries and other bulk storage areas incorporated minimal windows that provided sufficient light for inventory management while maintaining the dry, dark conditions necessary for long-term food preservation. The architectural relationships between different spaces within the manor created circulation patterns that reflected lighting availability and influenced the influence, timing, and organization of household activities throughout daily and seasonal cycles. Corridors and transitional spaces received minimal lighting investment, requiring users to carry portable illumination when moving through the building during dark periods. Stairways and other potentially dangerous passages incorporated strategic window placement to ensure basic safety lighting during normal daylight hours while accepting that evening movement through the building would require careful planning and artificial illumination. The defensive features integrated into the manor's design created complex interactions with lighting requirements that forced architectural compromises between security and illumination throughout the structure. Arrow loops and other military features provided minimal natural lighting while ensuring defensive capability during potential conflicts. The gatehouse and entrance areas balanced the need for adequate lighting to identify visitors and conduct security inspections against defensive requirements that limited window sizes and positions. Interior defensive positions required strategic lighting that could illuminate approaches while avoiding silhouetting. Defenders against bright backgrounds. The seasonal performance of the manor's lighting systems revealed how annual cycles of daylight availability affected domestic routines and spatial utilization patterns that influenced household organization and resource allocation. Winter months. Concentrated family activities in spaces that could be efficiently heated and lighted, while summer conditions allowed expanded use of areas that were economically prohibitive to illuminate during dark periods. Spring and autumn transitions required adjustment periods as households adapted their routines to changing lighting conditions and modified resource allocation patterns to accommodate seasonal lighting needs. The maintenance requirements associated with the manor's lighting systems created ongoing relationships between architectural features and household management practices that affected daily operations and long-term building performance. Window cleaning and repair required specialized equipment and techniques that influenced household staffing and seasonal maintenance schedules. Candle holders and other lighting fixtures required regular cleaning and occasional replacement to maintain optimal performance. Draft control measures needed constant adjustment to balance ventilation requirements against lighting efficiency, requiring ongoing attention from household staff trained in these specialized tasks. The broader implications of the manor's lighting. Geography extended beyond immediate domestic convenience to encompass questions of social display, economic efficiency, and cultural values that characterized medieval noble life. The building's lighting capabilities influenced Sir Geoffrey's ability to entertain guests, conduct business affairs, and maintain social relationships that were essential to his position within regional political networks. The household's lighting. Expenses affected resource allocation decisions that could influence everything from charitable activities to military obligations. The architectural accommodation of lighting limitations shaped family routines and social interactions in ways that would influence the development of medieval domestic culture. But the ultimate test of your architectural lighting solutions lay not in their theoretical optimization, but in their daily performance under the demanding conditions of medieval winter, when shortened daylight and harsh weather would reveal whether your carefully planned spaces could sustain the complex requirements of noble household life. The harsh winter of 1263 provided the ultimate test of your architectural decisions. As Sir Geoffrey's household confronted the full severity of medieval lighting limitations and discovered both the successes and failures of your carefully planned design. By January, when daylight hours had shrunk to barely 8 hours between sunrise and sunset, every aspect of domestic life had reorganized itself around the geography of illumination you had created, revealing how architectural choices rippled through the complex social and economic relationships that sustained medieval noble households. Thought the Great Hall's performance during the depths of winter demonstrated both the possibilities and the costs associated with architectural ambition in medieval domestic design. During the Christmas festivities, Sir Geoffrey successfully entertained 40 guests in a space illuminated by 60 tallow candles and 10 oil lamps, creating a magnificent display of hospitality that reinforced his social position and political relationships throughout Yorkshire. Yet this single evening's entertainment consumed lighting resources equivalent to 3 months of normal household illumination, forcing subsequent economies that affected every aspect of domestic life. 4 weeks afterward, the hall's impressive dimensions that had facilitated grand entertaining became a liability. During routine winter evenings, when the space remained largely unused due to prohibitive lighting costs, Lady Margaret's adaptation to the Bowers lighting limitations revealed the ingenuity and resilience that characterized medieval women's approaches to domestic management challenges. She reorganized her daily schedule to concentrate detailed needlework during the precious hours when natural light remained adequate, while reserving evening hours for activities that required less precise visions, supervising household staff. planning meals, or entertaining family members with stories and music. Her development of collaborative work arrangements where multiple women shared single light sources for their textile projects created social bonds while reducing individual lighting costs, demonstrating how architectural constraints could foster community relationships. The household staff's response to lighting limitations throughout the manor revealed how social hierarchies influenced access to illumination and created adaptive strategies that reflected medieval labor relationships. Kitchen staff began food preparation before dawn to maximize use of natural daylight for detailed tasks like cleaning poultry or preparing vegetables, while saving simple activities like stirring pots or tending fires for darker periods when minimal lighting sufficed. Servants developed efficient workflows that minimized movement through poorly lit areas of the manor, while creating informal cooperation. Networks that allowed shared use of expensive artificial lighting when circumstances demanded detailed work. During evening hours, the solar's design proved most successful in accommodating winter lighting challenges, as its optimal window placement and modest dimensions allowed Sir Geoffrey to maintain essential business activities throughout the darkest months without catastrophic lighting expenses. The room's eastern exposure provided adequate morning illumination for correspondence and account management, while afternoon natural light permitted reading and document review activities that formed crucial components of estate management. Evening business activities could be conducted efficiently with minimal artificial lighting, making this space economically viable for extended daily use even during the most resource-constrained winter periods. The chapel's lighting performance during winter months revealed how religious and practical considerations intersected in medieval architectural design. Morning prayers benefited from optimal natural lighting that reinforced religious symbolism while providing adequate illumination for liturgical activities. However, evening devotions required artificial lighting that created ongoing tension between religious obligations and economic constraints, forcing compromises between ideal worship conditions and practical resource limitations. The chapel's architectural success in accommodating natural lighting contrasted with its dependence on expensive artificial illumination for complete religious observance throughout extended winter darkness. The circulation patterns that emerged throughout the manor during winter months demonstrated how lighting limitations influenced spatial use and social interactions in ways you had not fully anticipated during the design phase. Family members and staff developed preferred routes through the building that maximized use of naturally lit areas, while avoiding poorly illuminated spaces that required expensive artificial lighting for safe navigation. Common areas like the hall became gathering points during daylight hours, but were largely abandoned during dark periods, when their lighting costs became prohibitive. The development of these adaptive circulation patterns revealed how architectural decisions influenced social dynamics and community formation within domestic spaces. The maintenance challenges that emerged during winter operations highlighted the ongoing relationship between architectural design and household management practices. Window maintenance became crucial as accumulated grime and weather damage reduced natural light transmission during periods when every ray of sunlight held premium value. Draft control around windows and doors required constant adjustment to balance heat retention against lighting quality, creating ongoing tensions between comfort and illumination that affected daily domestic routines. The cleaning and maintenance of artificial lighting equipment, candle holders, oil lamps, reflective surfaces became specialized household tasks that required trained staff and regular resource allocation. Sir Geoffrey's business relationships adapted to the manor's lighting limitations through scheduling adjustments and spatial accommodations that reflected broader patterns of medieval commercial life. Important negotiations were postponed until natural lighting conditions could provide adequate illumination without excessive candle expenses, while routine business matters were conducted during optimal daylight hours to avoid artificial lighting costs. The manor's reputation for appropriate hospitality required occasional, expensive evening entertainments that demonstrated social status while creating financial pressures that influenced other household spending priorities. The economic impact of the manors. Lighting systems became apparent through detailed household account records that documented both obvious expenses, like candle purchases, and hidden costs, like reduced productivity during dark periods and increased labor requirements for lighting-related maintenance activities. Winter lighting expenses consistently exceeded budget projections, forcing seasonal adjustments and other household expenditures that affected everything from food quality to charitable giving. The manor's lighting costs influenced Sir Geoffrey's broader economic planning and affected his participation in regional political activities that required travel and entertainment expenses. The technological adaptations that emerged throughout the winter revealed how medieval households developed innovative solutions to lighting challenges that reflected both resource constraints and human ingenuity. Lady Margaret's women experimented with mirror arrangements that redirected natural light into darker work areas, creating improved illumination conditions without additional fuel costs. Kitchen staff developed efficient artificial lighting techniques that maximized illumination, while minimizing candle consumption through strategic placement and shared use arrangements. Household members created informal information networks that shared knowledge about candle quality, suppliers, and conservation techniques that helped optimize lighting resources. The social implications of lighting limitations became apparent through changes in family interactions, community relationships, and cultural activities that reflected architectural influences on domestic life. Extended family gatherings concentrated during periods when natural lighting made social activities economically feasible, while winter evenings became more intimate occasions focused on immediate family members who could share expensive artificial lighting. Reading and intellectual activities adapted to seasonal lighting availability, with intensive study periods during long summer days and reduced scholarly activity during winter months, when artificial lighting costs became prohibitive. The architectural lessons learned through winter operations at Sir Geoffrey's Manor provided valuable insights for future construction projects, revealing both successful design strategies and critical oversights that influenced your subsequent work. The Solar's lighting optimization demonstrated effective techniques for creating economically viable workspace illumination, while the Great Hall's seasonal performance highlighted the tensions between social requirements and practical lighting costs. The chapel's natural lighting success contrasted with its artificial lighting dependence, revealing opportunities for improved design, integration of religious and practical considerations. The broader cultural impact of lighting limitations in medieval domestic architecture became apparent through the manor's influence on regional building practices and social customs that reflected architectural solutions to shared challenges. Other noble families observed Sir Geoffrey's lighting arrangements and adapted successful strategies to their own construction projects, while modifying techniques that proved inadequate for their specific circumstances. The manor's performance during winter months contributed to evolving standards for medieval domestic architecture that balanced social requirements against practical lighting limitations. As spring returned and natural lighting once again provided adequate illumination for extended daily activities, the full measure of your architectural achievement became apparent through the household's successful survival of winters, lighting challenges, and the adaptive strategies that had emerged to maximize the building's potential. The manor had proven capable of sustaining complex, noble household activities throughout the year's most demanding period, though at costs and with compromises that revealed the fundamental constraints that shaped all aspects of medieval domestic life. Your success as Master William de Ashby lay not in eliminating the lighting challenges that confronted medieval households, but in creating architectural solutions that made those challenges manageable within the broader context of 13th century life. The manor's geography of illumination and shadow would continue to influence domestic routines, social relationships, and economic decisions for generations, embodying the ongoing medieval struggle to create spaces where human civilization could flourish despite the enormous constraints imposed by technological limitations and natural cycles that govern daily existence. The flickering candle flames that illuminated Sir Geoffrey's manor on winter evenings represented more than simple lighting. They embodied humanity's persistent effort to push back against darkness, to create spaces of warmth and productivity within a world that seemed designed to frustrate such ambitions. Your architectural achievement lay in recognizing these fundamental constraints while designing spaces that accommodated them with grace, dignity, and the quiet heroism that characterized all successful medieval adaptations to an unforgiving world. And so we conclude our journey through the tedious yet fascinating details of medieval lighting, having discovered why even the wealthiest 13th century households would curse the candles they could barely afford to burn. From the economic burden of the chandler's trade to the daily dilemmas of rationed illumination. From the catastrophic dangers of open flames to the architectural accommodations that shaped domestic space itself, we have seen how something as simple as light became one of medieval life's most persistent challenges. Perhaps tonight, as you drift toward sleep in the gentle glow of modern illumination, you might spare a thought for those countless medieval souls who lived their lives in the precarious balance between expensive light and encompassing darkness, forever cursing the very flames upon which their civilization depended.